Hi boys and girls, today we're going to talk about the different literary genres that we read. So my first question to you is, what is a literary genre? We know that a literary genre is a particular style or type of writing. We also know that there are two main literary genres. We have fiction and we have nonfiction. Think of what is the difference between fiction and nonfiction. Okay, so let's start with fiction first. We know that fiction is writing that tells about imaginary people and events. We also know fiction are stories that are made up, they're not real. On the other hand, nonfiction are accounts of real people, real places, and real events. There's fact, right? It's not fiction. That's why it's called nonfiction. So let's start by talking about fiction. Now, we know that fiction and nonfiction are the main literary genres, but did you know that there are subgenres? So there are other genres that fall underneath fiction. So let's talk about those first. So the first one we're going to look at is fantasy. Now, fantasy is a genre, right? It is a literary genre, and it falls under fiction. These are stories that are made up. So what is fantasy? Is basically the type of story where the author has created a story that takes place in a magical world where anything is possible. Take a look on your screen and look at some of these examples. We have Harry Potter, Wings of Fire, Lord of the Rings. So these are all examples of fantasy books. Notice the picture of the unicorn. When we think of unicorns, we also think of fantasy, right? It's an imaginary or a magical representation of something. The next fiction subgenre we're going to look at is historical fiction. Now, this is my personal favorite. Think of the word historical. What do you hear in the word historical? History, right? So basically, historical fiction are stories with fictional characters and events in a historical setting. So basically, the character is made up, but the events could have happened in history at some point. The story takes the reader back to a particular time period where they learn about the everyday life of a person. The character may interact with actual historical characters, but usually the main character is not based on a real person. So basically what that means, boys and girls, is that in a book, a historical fiction book, the main character might interact with another character that was actually real. For example, maybe Abraham Lincoln comes up in the book. And of course, we know Abraham Lincoln was real, he did exist, but maybe the main character never existed and that story was made up. Take a look at some of these examples. Number the Stars and The Book Thief, as you know, is Miss Kling's favorite. These two books are actually take place, or the historical events where these books take place is the Holocaust. So we know that the Holocaust really did happen. It really did exist. But the characters in these two books are actually fiction. They're made up. So that's why they are historical fiction. Take a look at the other examples of historical fiction books. Okay, the next fiction subgenre is science fiction. Now, what is science fiction? Think of the word science. Science fiction are stories that are based on real or imagined inventions. Also focuses on space travel or life in other worlds, and it usually takes place in the future. It often explores the unknown. Notice the little clue here with the alien. So that's connected with science fiction. Look at some of the examples. Star Trek is an example of science fiction, and so is Star Wars. and most of the Goosebumps series as well. Okay, here's another fiction subgenre. We have horror. Now, when you think of horror, you think of maybe Halloween, right? Something scary. And this genre is just that. So it is fiction, it is made up, right? And the events in the story evoke some type of feeling of fright, right? Or being afraid in both the characters in the story and also us as readers. And the next fiction subgenre is mystery. Mystery is also fiction and it deals with the solution of a crime. And it usually unrevealing of secrets, right? There's secrets going on throughout the story. Take a look at some of these examples. I know many of you are familiar with the 39 Clues. I've seen many of my students reading that book. So that would be considered a mystery book. Okay, and the next fiction subgenre is the most popular of all, realistic fiction. Look at the word realistic. When I hear the word realistic, I see the word real, right? But wait a minute, we're talking about fiction and we know fiction is made up. So what is realistic fiction? Realistic fiction stories are stories that could actually happen in real life. Okay? The characters are made up, but the events could actually happen. The setting is realistic. The characters in the story speak and act like real people do. And the story describes real life problems and real life events. This is the most popular because kids can connect to this. So take a look at the examples. Holes, one of Miss Queen's favorite books as well. Okay? Any of the books from the Babysitter's Club, right, from that series, also can be considered realistic fiction because all these events could happen. They didn't happen, that's why it's fiction, but they could happen. Okay, how about a fable? I know you've heard of fables before. So fables are also fiction. They're a subgenre of fiction. And fables are basically short stories where usually the characters could be animals, okay? Not always will they be animals, but usually they're animals as characters. Fables also teach a lesson, and they usually teach a lesson about what is important in life. Look at some of these examples that I'm pretty sure you've heard of before. The Lion and the Mouse, The Ant and the Grasshopper, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Now, The Boy Who Cried Wolf is actually a book that does not have animals as characters, right? But it does teach a lesson about what's important in life, which is not to lie, right? Notice how a lot of these characters or a lot of these books who have animals as characters, the animals actually speak. So that can be another clue of what a fable could be. Okay, next let's talk about folk tales. Now, folk tales are also fiction, they're made up. Folk tales are stories that are told from generation to generation, and it's usually done by word of mouth. Basically, what that means is that these stories are told in person or verbally. Even though most of them are written down eventually, at the beginning they were just told. Sometimes different versions exist in different cultures of these stories. And did you know that folk tales, usually their original storyteller or the first person to ever come up with these stories is unknown? Folk tales can involve animals, and usually the number 3, it also includes wishes and magic. So think of Goldilocks and the 3 bears. 3, right, there's that clue, the number 3. And we also know that this is actually a story that has very different versions, right, depending on where you're from. Another popular book of folktale is One Grain of Rice. Okay, let's talk about myths. I know a lot of students really enjoy this genre because I know that you've experienced it in previous years. So what are myths? We know that myths are obviously fiction, they're made up, right? They really don't exist. But myths are the early people's way to explain the universe and how it all came to be. Gods and goddesses are present in myths, right? The gods and goddesses are usually heroes, right? And they're superhuman in nature. Human emotions are experienced by the gods. And of course, we know magic is usually present in these type of myths. And another clue to identify a myth is that gods sometimes appear in a disguised form. Okay, so look at some of these examples. So Greek myths is definitely a popular myth. The lightning thief can also be considered a myth. And of course, Hercules. Okay, let's take a look at legends. Legends, again, are also fiction. So legends are stories that are handed down from the past that people tell as being true. But sometimes the details are so difficult to confirm or prove. The person telling the story usually does not claim to be an eyewitness to the event, but heard it from someone else. So it's like, I heard from so and so who heard from so and so who heard from so and so. So you know that things were changed. It's just like that game telephone. Legends often contain a moral or a lesson, and it's usually about the community and values. In addition, legends often involve supernatural or religious elements. Take a look at some of the examples of legends. Okay, and we come to the last fiction subgenre, fairy tales. What are fairy tales? Usually they begin with once upon a time or long, long ago. It involves or includes magic, right, or something enchanted. The setting is often a forest or a castle, not always, but most of the time. Fairy tales also include a good character, or what is another word for a good character? I hope you said an antagonist. I'm sorry, protagonist. Protagonist is the good character. And there's also the evil character or the villain or the antagonist in the story. Fairy tales also involve problems that are solved, right? And the good people in the story usually live happily ever after. Examples, many of the Disney princess examples, right, could apply to fairy tales. Okay, now let's talk about nonfiction. Now we know nonfiction, as we mentioned before, is real. It's real accounts of real people, real events, real things that happened. So let's take a look at what are some of the nonfiction subgenres. Let's start with biography. What is a biography? A biography is a true story about a person's life or parts of their life. So, for example, if a biography is only written about how someone became a basketball player, it might not start with the day they were born. It might start with the first game that they had. So it could be about their entire life from birth to present time or to death, or it can be just about a couple of years in their life. Biographies are also written in third person point of view. So we will see pronouns like he, she, they, them. Take a look at some of these examples. I'm probably sure that you've even read some of these books. So any of the Who Is series are definitely biographies because the author is not who the person is about in the story. So take a look at this picture on the bottom. It's almost like someone is doing an interview and jotting things down. That's what a biography is all about. Someone interviews either the person or maybe someone who knew the person very well and then creates the story. Then we have autobiography, which is the difference or which is different of a biography. An autobiography is a story or a book that people write about their own life. Autobiographies are written in first person point of view, so we will see pronouns like I, me, my, or mine. Notice how I underlined the letter A in autobiography. This is a clue that you can use to help you remember what an autobiography is. So it starts with the letter A, and so does the word author. So basically, the author of the story is writing about their lives. Also, notice how it starts with the word auto, A-U-T-O. Think of the author automatically knows everything about their own life. Take a look at some of the examples of autobiographies. You might have read some of these before. And then last but not least, the last nonfiction subgenre we're going to look at is informational writing. So what is informational writing? Informational writing is texts that provide facts about a variety of topics, such as sports, animals, science, history, careers, travel, geography, space, weather, etc. So basically, informational writing are like the textbooks, right? They're filled with facts and information.